Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Our Lady of Perpetual Help Church. It's nice to have you here today. Tonight, as you know, we're going to have Father Greg Boyle. But before that, I wanted to mention a couple of things to you. First of all, this event tonight is organized by the Women's Guild. And I heard that it's been 10 years since the last time that they did this. How time flies, doesn't it? But I know Father Greg has written many more books that he's going to explain today. And the Women's Guild has been the oldest ministry here at our parish. It's been serving our parish for over 71 years. And today, and for today's event and other events that they've had, they've worked in cooperation with a number of other ministries in our church. The Hispanic ministry, the adult ministry, the Filipino community, the OLPH school teachers, and our confirmation youth that we have here present today. So thank you all for helping bring about this event. Give them a round of applause. And in case if you don't know me, my name is Father Danny Garcia, and I am the administrator here at the parish. Please remember to turn off your cell phones at this time. And the restrooms, we have a restroom in the back. They're all single restrooms. One in the back, we have one here on New Ave, and then we have another one here on Downey Avenue, in case you need to use the restroom. This event will be live streamed. It's on right now, so welcome all those viewers that are watching us from the comfort of their homes. Tonight, there will also be, after Father presents, at the end, there will be questions and answers. And so after that, or during that, there's going to be a collection. And this collection, the Goodwill collection, will go to the Homeboy Industries that Father Greg brought forth into this community, into our community. It's the largest gang rehabilitation and re-entry program in the world. It provides hope, training, and support to formerly gang-involved and previously incarcerated people, allowing them to redirect their lives and become contributing members of our community. That is their mission. And so we are here today to support that. In our works of the church is also to help others. And this is an opportunity not just to listen to Father Greg Boyle, but to also share and be generous with others who need our help. So now I introduce to you Lucy Solares, and she is our Vice President of the Women's Guild. So let us give her a round of applause, and she will introduce Father Greg Boyle.
Good evening. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Father Gregory Boyle. It's been 11 years since his visit to our parish, and we are very happy that he is visiting us again tonight. As Father Danny mentioned, Father Boyle is a former pastor, and he was with the Dolores Mission in Los Angeles and the founder and director of Homeboy Industries, the world's largest gang intervention and rehabilitation program. Among his many accolades, Father Boyle has received the California Peace Prize and been inducted to the California Hall of Fame. In 2014, the White House named Father Boyle as Champion of Change. Father Boyle is also an acclaimed author. He recently published his 6th book, Forgiving Everyone Everything. Limited copies of this book will be available for purchase at the Carey Center after his presentation, and he will be signing the book for you. Please join me in welcoming Father Gregory Boyle.
Well, thank you very much. It's a privilege. I didn't know it had been that long since I spoke here. I left like 3 days ago from Los Angeles to get here because of, time is kind of odd. I had surgery last week, and they, so I was out of commission for a week, and they took a chunk out of my shoulder because there was lymphoma in it, and they seemed to get everything they need to get. But, there are 120,000 gang members in LA County, and they all have my cell phone. So word spread, and they were all asking me how I was, and I say, I'm fine. And I'd send it out, but I'd send a meme. Do you know who Mr. Bean is? Yeah. So there's a video meme of Mr. Bean, and he's dressed like a surgeon. He's in scrubs, and he's in an operating room, and he's leaning into the patient, and he's going like this, So I sent it to a homie who asked how I was doing. I said, I'm fine, and I sent Mr. Bean. And he wrote back, and he says, to be honest with you, Pops, your doctor looks creepy. The fact that he thought Mr. Bean had actually operated on me made my whole day. So anyway, here's why I think you're here tonight. It has little to do with me. I think it has to do with us. It has to do with our longing that somehow we want the world to look differently than it currently looks. And so we want to imagine and align our imagination with God's somehow. And we want to see and imagine something different. So we want to imagine a circle of compassion, and then we want to imagine nobody standing outside that circle. We want to somehow get to a place where we obliterate the illusion that we are separate, that there's an us and a them. Mother Teresa diagnosed the world's ills correctly when she suggested that the problem in the world is that we've just forgotten that we belong to each other. So how do we stand against forgetting that? How do we inch our way out to the margins, which we're all invited to do by the marrow of the gospel, to stand at the margins, and then you watch the margins get erased just because you're standing there. And you stand with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless, and you get to stand with the easily despised and the readily left out. You stand with those whose burdens are more than they can bear, and those whose dignity has been denied. And you stand with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop, and you stand with the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. And you stand against forgetting that we belong to each other. And you brace yourself as you stand at the margins, because the world will accuse you of wasting your time. But the prophet Jeremiah writes, "For in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing." Well, none of that makes any sense at all, except for the fact that our God is spacious and expansive. And there is nothing more consequential in the world than our notion of God. If our notion is puny and small and tiny, then you won't have any choice but to be puny, small, and tiny. I remember years ago I had a spiritual director who said to me once, "You know, we need a better God than the one we have." He was a Jesuit. But of course he's right, because often enough our notion of God doesn't fit the God we actually have. Meister Eckhart, who was a theologian and a mystic, used to say that it is a lie, any talk of God that doesn't comfort you. And he's quite right, I think. You know, many years ago, I was saying Mass at San Fernando Juvenile Hall, and it was a packed gym. And there was like 500 gang members mainly there, sitting on folding chairs in the gym. And I was up on this little raised platform, and I had my albon and my stole, and the homies would get up and they would do the readings, and they had these little hojas, these sheets that had the readings in English and in Spanish, so you could follow along. So I just closed my eyes and I closed the little folleto on my lap, and I was listening to the readings being proclaimed. And the first guy got up and did the Old Testament reading, and then he sat down. The second guy got up to do the responsorial psalm. And I don't know, there was kind of like an overabundance of confidence in his voice. And he gets up and he says, "The Lord is exhausted." And I said, "What the hell?" And I looked down at and it was, "The Lord is exalted." And I remember thinking at the time, wow, that's way better. Because if we're honest with ourselves, you know, the exalted God is really our projection onto God. If I was God, I would want to be exalted. But it's a human projection onto God. But the exhausted God, everyone in this church can connect to it, you know. If your parents or if your grandparents, you know, your grandkids come for the weekend or something and they leave and your neighbor asks you, "How do you feel?" "Oh my God, I'm pooped. I'm exhausted." I mean, the grandkids were here the week. It's a good tired. You know exactly what exhausted means. You know that it means an extension of yourself to be there for somebody else with love. It's a way better notion than the exalted God. I suspect it's the one that's closer to the God we actually have. We've settled for a partial God, and we shouldn't. We should hold out for this greater than great God who loves you without measure and without regret. I have a friend, Mirabai Starr, who's a mystic, and she writes about mystics, and she says, once you know the God of love, you fire all the other gods, which is the adult task of maturing in our faith, is firing all the other gods. I remember, during this pandemic thing, we often enough have the Zoom experience, and I remember even upcoming Sunday, I have 5 sisters and 2 brothers, and they're all married, and we would gather once a month on Zoom on Sunday at 4, and so we're going to do it again. And not long ago we did it, and it was the anniversary of my mom's death, who died somewhere like in the first year of the Donald Trump presidency. It was somewhere in there. Can't remember that year, but and my mom was 92, and she died like we all want to die, in your own home, in your own bed, surrounded by your kids. And so, my father had died like 25 years ago, and she wasn't a lick afraid of dying. Once, like 3 weeks before she died, she said to me, with great kind of, excitement, she said, "I've never done this before," and it was something you might say, just before skydiving, And she was sharp as a tack all to the end. In fact, she at the end of her life, she was watching so much MSNBC. She was becoming Rachel Maddow, and but she was just not afraid at all of dying. She would just welcomed it as kind of this next thing. In fact, the day before she died, I happened to be sitting at her bed, and I was just alone there, which never happened. There were always many of us around her bed. But it was just me, and she was asleep, and she opened her eyes, and she saw me sitting at the foot of her bed, and she went, "Oh, for crying out loud," and she went back to sleep. Well, she was pissed off that she hadn't died yet, and sorry. But on the very next day, I was sitting at her bed again, as rare as it was, at noon, all alone. My sisters had gone out to get lunch or something, and at exactly 12, she sits up, she opens her eyes, she lets out this wondrous, glorious gasp, and she left us, skydiving. And nobody in earshot of that sound could ever be afraid of death again. But I remember that during the last weeks of her life, we'd be 2 or 4 or all 8 of her kids around her bed, and she'd be kind of in and out of consciousness. And whenever she came to, she'd lock onto one of us, and she'd have this laser beam focus. And she would look at that one kid of hers, and with breathless delight, she'd say, "Oh, you're here. You're here." And I remembered that as we were burying her, that I suspect that may well be the singular agenda item of our exhausted God, which is to look at you with breathless delight and say, "You're here. You're here." Once we know the God of love, we fire all the other gods. We receive the tender glance of God, and then we choose to be in the world this tender glance. We choose to be in the world who God is, compassionate and loving and kind. And so there is nothing more consequential than our notion of God that we hold. It will determine absolutely everything. So Homeboy Industries was started a long time ago, during the time I was pastor of the poorest parish in the city of Los Angeles, Dolores Mission. And it was nestled in the middle of 2 public housing projects, Pico Gardens and Aliso Village. At the time, it was the largest grouping of public housing west of the Mississippi. We had 8 gangs in those 2 housing projects, which is unheard of in housing projects to have that many gangs. And the LAPD deemed my parish to have the highest concentration of gang activity in the whole city. And so I buried my first young person killed because of this sadness in 1988. And next week I will bury my 257th. Not all from that community, but I know a lot of gang members. I get asked. So the first thing we did was we started a school because there were so many middle school, junior high age gang members who had been given the boot from their home school. Nobody wanted them, so they were wreaking havoc in the projects, and they were writing on the walls, and they were selling drugs, and they were violent. So I walked out to where they were, and I would kind of isolate them a little bit. And I would say, "Hey, if I found a school that would take you, would you go?" And to my surprise, every single one of them said, "Yeah, I would." And then I couldn't find a school that would take them, so that kind of forced my hand. So right across the street from the church is our parochial school, our elementary school, Dolores Mission School. And it's a big old cement building. The first 2 floors are the grades K to 8. But the entire 3rd floor was the convent, and where the sisters lived. And so I gathered the nuns one evening in their living room, and I sat them down, and I said, hey, would you guys mind, moving out? And we could turn the convent into a school for gang members. And they looked at each other, and they said, sure. And that was the extent of their entire discernment process. And so we were off and running, and gang members came in large numbers to our school, which created a disconnect for the parish, because parishioners would sidle up to me and they'd say, aren't churches supposed to be hermetically sealed, good people in and bad people out, which was a good gospel challenge. And then the gang members in short order would ask me, if only we had jobs. So myself and the women in the parish, and the parish was mainly women with children, we marched around the factories that surrounded the projects, trying to find felony-friendly employers. And that wasn't so forthcoming. So we started stuff, a maintenance crew, a landscaping crew, a crew to paint out graffiti, all made up of members of the rival 8 gangs in the projects. And then in 1992, after the Rodney King acquittal of the 4 police officers, it just ignited the whole city, those of you who were around then. And every pocket of poverty just ignited, except the poorest pocket, my parish. So the LA Times came and wanted to know, hey, why was that? And I said, well, I don't know. I think mainly part of it was the fact that we had 60 strategically hired gang members who had a reason to get up in the morning and a reason not to gangbang the night before, and more to the point of your question, a reason not to torch their own community. And so the article appeared the next day, and the following day I get summoned to the Beverly Hills office of a movie producer named Ray Stark, who happened to have $500 million. And he said, how do you think I should use my money? As I look back on it now, I can see that I woefully undershot my request, but I was young, I had hair, but I said, well, there's an abandoned bakery across the street from our school. You could buy it. There are ovens, they don't work, but you could fix them. And we could put hairnets on rival gang members, and they could bake bread, and we could call the place Homeboy Bakery. And that was the extent of my entire business plan. So he said sure. And so we were off and running. And a month later, we started Homeboy Tortillas in the Grand Central Market in downtown LA. Once we had plural, we changed our name from Jobs for a Future, which is what we called ourselves, to Homeboy Industries, as if there was any, industry involved in any of this. And not everything worked. I'll be the first to admit it. Homeboy Plumbing really was not hugely successful. Who knew? People didn't want gang members in their homes. I did not see that coming. And now nobody ever plans to do such a thing, but we evolved. We backed our way into becoming, as was mentioned kindly, the largest gang intervention rehab reentry program on the planet. So 10,000 folks a year walk through our headquarters in Chinatown. And and they want to imagine something different. Every single one comes barricaded behind a wall of shame and disgrace. And the only thing that can scale that wall is tenderness. Every single one walks through those doors with what a psychologist would call a disorganized attachment. Mom was either frightened or frightening. And you can't really calm yourself down if you've never been soothed. You know, the Buddhists say, "O nobly born, remember who you really are." That's kind of a motto at Homeboy in a way. We're kind of allergic to the idea of holding the bar up and asking folks to measure up. Instead, we hold the mirror up and we tell people the truth, that they're exactly what God had in mind when God made them. And then you watch them become that truth. You watch them inhabit that truth. And no bullet can pierce that. No 4 prison walls can keep it out. And death can't touch it because it's huge. We don't measure because our exhausted God doesn't measure, and why would we? O nobly born, remember who you really are. The homies say, especially those who have been locked up for a long time, will say, you know, we're used to being watched, but we're not used to being seen. And so you want to see people. A homie said to me, once you see me, I'll never forget what I look like. And so I suppose our first 15 years at Homeboy, we were concerned, we were sort of job-centric, and now we're healing-centered. And the idea is that, you know, an educated inmate may or may not go back to prison, or an employed one may or may not, but it is our absolute guarantee that a healed gang member won't ever reoffend, ever. But we have to reach in and we have to dismantle the messages of shame and disgrace that get in the way, that keep people from seeing their truth. You know, in the Acts of the Apostles, it has this one odd line, and it says simply, "And awe came upon everyone." And it suggests that the measure of health in any community at all may well reside in our ability to stand in awe at what the poor have to carry, rather than stand in judgment at how they carry it. So a number of years ago, I was invited to speak in Richmond, Virginia, and it was a in-service for social workers. And it's one of those things where they, you know, commandeer a hotel ballroom and they fill it with social workers, and you sign in from 9 to 5, and you get credits if you go, and then you and it was an in-service on gangs and stuff, and how for social workers to deal with gangs. And I'd done a lot of these before, you know, and so I said yes. I figured, you know, they have keynotes and breakout sessions and workshops, and I figured maybe I'd do a keynote, as I had in many of these before. So I said yes, and I bought my ticket. Well, you know, a week before I was to fly out, I pull out the letter that originally invited me, and to my horror, I discovered that I was to be the only speaker from 9 to 5 all damn day, you know, and as the homies would say, oh, hell no, I'm not going to be the only speaker. So I invited 2 trainees. We have an 18-month training program, so we have all these rival enemy gang members working side by side in 11 of our businesses, from bakeries to restaurants. So I pull in 2 homies, Andre and Jose, and I sit them down. I said, look, at the end of the week, you're flying with me to Richmond, Virginia. I'd like you to get up in front of 600 social workers and tell your stories. take your time. Because we got a long-ass day to fill. Well, I had never heard their stories, and Jose gets up first, and he's like 25 years old, and, been to prison, tattooed, shot caller from his neighborhood. And at that juncture, he was in like his 9th month with us there, and he had become a very valued member of the substance abuse team, a man solid in his own recovery, and now he's helping younger homies and homegirls with their addiction issues. And so not only had he been to prison and gang member, he also had a long stretch as a homeless man, even longer stretch as a heroin addict. So he gets up in front of 600 social workers, and he says, I guess you could say my mom and me, we didn't get along so good. I think I was 6 when she looked at me and she said, "Why don't you just kill yourself? You're such a burden to me." Well, 600 social workers audibly gasped. And then he says, "It sounds way worser in Spanish." Well, they did exactly what you did. They just roared with laughter. I mean, we got whiplash going from gasp to laugh. And then he continued, I think I was 9 when my mom drove me down to the deepest part of Baja California, and she walks me up to an orphanage. And she knocks on the door, and the guy comes to the door, and she says, "I found this kid." And she left me there for 90 days until my grandmother could get out of her where she had dumped me, and my grandmother came and rescued me. My mom beat me every single day of my elementary school years with things you could imagine and a lot of things you couldn't. Every day, my back was bloodied and scarred. In fact, I had to wear 3 t-shirts to school each day. First t-shirt, because the blood would seep through. Second t-shirt, you could still see it. Finally, the third t-shirt, you couldn't see any blood. Kids at school, they'd make fun of me. "Hey, fool, it's 100 degrees. Why are you wearing 3 t-shirts?" Then he stopped speaking, so overwhelmed with emotion. And he seemed to be staring at a piece of his story only he could see. And when he could regain his speech, he said through his tears, "I wore 3 t-shirts well into my adult years because I was ashamed of my wounds. I didn't want anybody to see them. But now I welcome my wounds. I run my fingers over my scars. My wounds are my friends. After all, how can I help heal the wounded if I don't welcome my own wounds?" And awe came upon everyone. The measure of our compassion lies not in our service of those on the margins, but only in our willingness to see ourselves in kinship with them. For the truth of the matter is this: if we don't welcome our own wounds, we may well be tempted to despise the wounded. Once you know the God of love, it changes everything. And that's the moment when the wave becomes the ocean, as Thich Nhat Hanh says. And then you let love live through you, and then you find your true self in loving, and you don't really become other-centered, you become loving-centered, and that's where the joy is, which is the only thing our exhausted God wants for us. My joy, yours, your joy complete. And we get there, I suspect, when we take seriously what Jesus took seriously, which are only 4 things: inclusion, nonviolence, unconditional loving kindness, and compassionate acceptance. That's where the joy is, and that's where we want to be. Let me finish with a story, and then I open it up for any comments or questions you might have. Every once in a while, it occurs to universities, to sometimes high schools, to force their students to read my books against their will, and I'm not complaining, but many years ago, my alma mater, Gonzaga University in Spokane, forced their incoming freshmen to read Tattoos on the Heart. And so they said, can you come up and speak? They're going to have a big venue on a Tuesday night, 1,000 people. Would you come? And I said, sure. And they said, can you bring 2 homies with you? And I said, sure. And so I always pick homies much the same way. Tomorrow morning I have an extremely early flight to New York City, so I have 2 homies who have never flown before and who are from rival gangs, you know. So I always pick homies who are mainly are from rivals, just to force them to share a hotel room, just to mess with them. And I always take homies who have never flown before, just for the thrill of seeing gang members panicked in the sky. And so this one time I picked Mario and Larry. Larry, an African-American gang member, and Mario, and they were from enemy gangs. And I'm used to homies being nervous Nellies on planes, you know. But not this guy Mario. I mean, it really freaked me out. He was like completely, totally, absolutely, panicked and it was starting to really kind of get to me, you know. In fact, he was so terrified, he was hyperventilating, which I had never seen before. You know, he's like that, and we hadn't even boarded the plane yet, and so we were at Burbank Airport, which is kind of smallish airport, as many of you have been there, and so they don't have that big, boarding hermetically sealed chute that you walk down to board the plane. You have to walk out onto the tarmac like you're the president, and climb up the stairs that lead to the front of the plane, or the stairs also that lead to the back of the plane. That's the big feature in Burbank. So I'm sitting there with Mario, and Larry is off somewhere walking around in the airport. And Mario is just completely freaking out. And our flight crew arrives. It's early morning, first flight of the day, and our flight crew arrives, and I can see them, and they're 2 female flight attendants, and both of them have very large cups of Starbucks coffee, and they're schlepping up the steps to board the plane. And Mario goes, when are we going to board the plane? I said, as soon as they sober up the pilots. There they go now. Perhaps I shouldn't have said that, but I should tell you that Mario is the most tattooed individual who's ever worked at Homeboy, which, trust me, is saying a lot. And he's all sleeved out with tattoos down to his fingertips. His neck is blackened with the name of his gang. Head shaved, covered with tattoos. Forehead, cheeks, chin, eyelids that say "the end," so that when he's lying in his coffin, there won't be any doubt for anybody, I guess. And So I thought, well, maybe if I walk him through the airport to calm him down. So I'm walking him through, and I'm noticing people. I'd never been in public with him, and people are like, oh my God, and like this, and clutching their kids a little more closely. I'm saying, wow, that's remarkable, because if you were to go to Homeboy tomorrow and ask anybody, quick, who's the kindest, most gentle soul who works at Homeboy, they'd think for a beat, and then they'd say, Mario. Yeah, Mario is. And Mario is proof that only the soul that loves with tenderness is the only person who has any chance of saving the world. He is a tender, loving, kind presence. In fact, he is also proof that the only non-delusional response to everything is kindness. So we get to Gonzaga, and there's a big talk Tuesday night. They don't tell you that you have all these other talks during the course of the day, in all these classrooms. And I say to him, I said, you guys get up and talk, because I'm mainly going to talk tonight. And they were reluctant, and it was hard going, but they did a good job, stories of torture and terror and violence. And honest to God, if their stories had been flames, you'd have to keep your distance. Otherwise, you'd get scorched. I would not have survived a single day of either of their childhoods. So we get to the main event, 1,000 people, and I get them up first, and they are terrified, but they speak for 7 minutes each, so that I can include them after my talk in the question and answer. And again, they did a good job. So I did my thing, and after that, I called them up to stand on either side of me at the podium, and I said, yeah, any questions? It was 1,000 people, and people just raised their hands, and yes, ma'am. And a woman says, yeah, I got a question. It's for Mario. Very first question right out the gate. And Mario is a tall, skinny drink of water, and he steps up to the microphone. He clutches the microphone. Yes? And she says, well, Mario, you say you're a father, and you have a son and a daughter. They're about to enter their teenage years. What wisdom do you impart to them? What advice do you give them? And he closes his eyes, and he clutches the microphone, and he's getting a friggin' hernia trying to come up with whatever the hell he's going to say. And when suddenly he blurts out, I just... As soon as he says those two words, he closes his eyes again, and he retreats to his microphone-clutching refuge, and he's starting to tremble. And I know that now he's losing his battle with his tears, but he wants to get the whole sentence out. I just don't want my kids to turn out to be like me. And there's silence until the woman who asked the question stands, and now it's her turn to cry. And she says, why wouldn't you want your kids to turn out to be like you? You are loving. You are kind. You are gentle. You are wise. I hope your kids turn out to be like you. And 1,000 total perfect strangers stand, and they will not stop clapping. And all Mario can do is hold his face in his hands, so overwhelmed that this room full of strangers had decided to return him to himself, and they had been returned to themselves. The tender glance receives the tender glance. The whole room seemed to look at Mario and say, you're here. You're here. And I think that's the only praise our exhausted God has any interest in. We're not invited to the margins to make a difference. We're invited to the margins so the folks there will make us different. And it is exquisitely mutual. Where there is no us and them, there's just us. Where we stand against forgetting that we belong to each other. Where we choose to take seriously what Jesus took seriously, because that's where the joy is. Where we decide to let love live through us. And we choose to be in the world who our God is. And then we cease to care if anyone accuses us of wasting our time at the margins. For in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing. Thank you very much. You know, I think they're going to pass the basket around, which we're in a church. That's how it works. But you know, I just 10 minutes. 7 minutes left, and you just go like this, and I'll go like that, and then just holler out your question. Yes, sir.
Could ask a personal, how is your about ministry?
Yeah. So, what in my own personal prayer? What kind of conversations do I have about my ministry with the God of love? And I'm not sure I have conversations so much. You know, for me a prayer is more about just sort of being anchored in silence and to, to be in the stillness. You know, I believe that my God protects me from nothing, but sustains me in everything. So part of the practice is to be able to sit in silence and to just kind of allow yourself to be filled with the utter fullness of God. So I don't think it's very conversational, you know. Later this week, I mentioned a kid that I was going to bury, and he was 13 years old. He was stabbed to death. His father was a gang member, worked at Homeboy, has been doing very well. But you know, he had so much. Utterly convinced that somehow his kid was killed as payback for all the horrible things he had done in his life as a gang member. And again, you know, it's so essential to fire the God that's like that, you know. And so I spent so much time with him just saying, this is not the God we have. You know, our God can't take his eyes off of you. Our God is holding you and carrying you and sustaining you during this time. So I don't think I have that much conversational stuff happening so much as wanting to be anchored in gratitude. And to stay, you know, I want to be where my feet are. and anchored in the present moment. And it's only your practice and your prayer in that sense that can keep you exactly here. Otherwise, you're anxious about tomorrow, or you're lamenting what happened yesterday. And God just wants you to be right here, because we're being saved in the present moment. And so anything that gets you to the present moment is essentially prayer.
Yes.
Yes.
Hello. Oh, go ahead, honey. Go ahead, ask a question.
Did anything bad happen in my life? Never. As the homies say, it's all good. It's all good, mijo. It's all good. It's all a gift. It's all an opportunity to learn something. It's all an invitation. It's important to find the invitation in everything. Sometimes you'll read the gospel, and every morning I read it very early. I get up at 2:30 in the morning, and I read it, and then I send it to my spiritual director, who's a homie named Sergio. A little reflection, brief, like sometimes a sentence. And he and I go back and forth, because sometimes there are things in the gospel where you just go, or in the first reading, where you just go, no, I don't believe that, You pick up a serpent and it's not going to kill you, or drink some poison. Remember that one? That was this week.
Yeah.
And so he always says, find the invitation. And he goes, you got to use your filter to do that. And the filter is, once you know the God of love, you can find the invitation in every single moment and every single thing that happens. So, yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Good evening, Father Boyle. My question's kind of philosophical. I don't know if you'll have an answer, but I know that you dealt with a lot of gangbangers that were bad people and that probably didn't seek forgiveness or didn't want to do that. And I think of the visual of Jesus when he died on the cross, and he had the two thieves on each side of him. And the one thief that tells Jesus, remember me when you go. And Jesus is like, yeah, I'll remember you. But the other thief never says anything. So I was wondering, number one, what happens to that thief? And number two, what happens to the people you come across that they're that thief? So that's what I was wondering. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, I'll be 69 years old. I've been working with gang members for 40 years. I've never, ever met a bad person, ever. Not once, not close. I've met wounded people, damaged people, despondent people, traumatized people, and mentally ill people. But I've never met a bad person. That doesn't make me naive. I just think, how does God see it? I don't think Jesus thought that one guy on one side was a good guy and the other guy was a bad guy. There's no such thing. If you think there's such a thing as good people and bad people, we cannot make progress. Period. In anything. In gang violence and in police reform. Now, I was listening on the radio coming over in Memphis about the 5 police officers who were just charged with second-degree homicide in the death of that young man who they had stopped. I don't know. I mean, I've been doing this a long time. A lot of times people will want to kind of have special trainings and different things, or they'll even talk about bad apples. How can we root out the bad apples? Nope, no bad apples, no bad people. But there's a notion that always gets us into trouble, and it's the notion that there's such a thing as good people and bad people. I don't believe it. I don't think the day will come at the end of my life where God will say, you know that thing you said about good people and bad people? Whoo, you're really off. No. I don't believe for a second that our God is like that. So, if we can figure it out and see people's hearts, the day may come when we stop punishing people and we seek to heal instead. We've had 40 mass shootings in 26 days of 2023, which is just sort of staggering. But there's nobody bad here. If you think it's about hate, we won't make progress. If you think it's about hate, then all you do is denounce hate, and that's why we don't make progress. But if you think it's about health, then you roll up your sleeves and you try to help people who are isolated and lonely and mentally ill and tormented and carry mental anguish. Then we believe and stand against forgetting that we belong to each other. But if you think it's about hate, I just don't think we're going to make any progress. I was at Chicago Midway Airport, and it's the tale of two T-shirts. There was a woman, and it says, "Love, not hate." And I remember thinking at the time, oh, that's why we don't make any progress. Because it's, I love, and I'm against people who hate. Really? But in the same airport was another woman with a T-shirt, and it just had one word, and it said, unwell. And I go, finally, progress. And I believe that. I think that's, if I denounced hate, then it's about me. We're not trying to convince people not to hate. Nobody healthy in the history of the world has ever hated. If you say to yourself, well, I hate this person, well, you've identified a place that's not healthy. And that's okay. How do we help each other? How do we walk each other home to health and well-being? Real love means you love and want the well-being of the other. But if you begin at a place that says these two unshakable truths, everybody's unshakably good, and we belong to each other. Imagine the progress that would happen if we believe those two things. But we don't. We believe it's us and them. He hates, I love. Welcome to why we don't make progress. But we could. And the prison system is a good example because, the day might come when we stop punishing wound and we seek to heal it. Anyway, I don't want to overstay my welcome, and I have an early flight, so thank you all very much.
Thank you, Father Boyle. Your presentation was very inspirational. And now I want to let everybody know we have refreshments out in the front of the church, and Father Boyle will be at the Carey Center for those that are interested in purchasing his latest book, which he will sign. Thank you once again for coming.